Hi guys. So by popular request today, I thought I would combine two things that I'm really passionate about. That's ASMR videos and sculpture. Now the kind of sculpture I tend to gravitate towards is called portrait sculpture. This is where I try and get things as close to real life as I possibly can. I also find sculpture very cathartic. It really helps me de-stress and kind of turn my brain off and just really focus on one task and getting things perfect. I also find it really satisfying as the final stages get closer and the sculpture kind of comes to life and everything just kind of starts to tie together and look really nice sometimes. Now, I don't usually like to make any kind of special requests to share my videos, but because this one has been such a huge effort, not only trying to capture Henry in the clay, but also trying to document my process as relaxing and cinematically as I possibly can. I would love it if you guys would share this one with a friend, or maybe on a forum, or just with anybody that enjoys Henry or his movies. I'd love to do more videos like this in the future and show the whole process, from start to finish. So give this video a like, and if it does well, I'll definitely consider doing more celebrities or characters, or maybe even a fellow ASMR artist in future videos. So leave any suggestions of people that you'd like to see in the comments, and I hope you enjoy the video. So for this video, I'll be demonstrating some techniques using my recent Henry Cavill piece. For those of you wondering why he's bald, unless I don't intend to cast a piece, I don't usually sculpt hair on. Instead, I insert synthetic hair later on, once it's been cast into a more lifelike material, usually silicone or wax. You'll notice the sculpt is fairly close to being finished. It's still missing some finesse and final smoothing in places, but I wanted to show you guys some close-up, quite intricate detail work, which hopefully you'll find extra tingly and relaxing. When it comes to detail, I find crafting the eyes to probably be the most complex and in-depth part of the face. Even though they're such a small area, there are so many nuances you have to pay attention to, and you can really throw the whole look of the portrait with even the slightest millimeter being off. It took me a long time and a lot of practice to begin to learn things like how far back the corners cut into the eye ridge, or that the outer corner is always higher than the inner, or how deep the tear ducts cut behind the eyes and then sweep forwards towards the nose. I'd seen thousands of eyes my whole life before I discovered sculpting, and you realise how little we actually know about the eye until you start sculpting them. So I would usually mark the eyes in early during the portrait and bring them up at the same pace of the rest of the features. However, for the purposes of demonstrating the process, I've left one eye untouched to give you an idea of how I go about tackling this area. I usually start with spherical lumps of clay in roughly the correct place around the eye socket, onto which I'll mark out the approximate shape of the eye. I look at lots of pictures of my subject throughout, and I use anatomically correct sculptures of eyes to make sure I'm staying true to real life. This is what is known as reference material, and it's the single most important asset in a sculptor's toolkit. Speaking of toolkits, I actually have hundreds of sculpting tools, but I tend to gravitate towards a select 6 to 8 essentials that I'll cycle between while working. So let me show you some of them now. As you saw in the last clip, I was using a syringe with a needle bent into a loop. I find this is a rather cheap way of hand making lots of different loop tools, and I would say loop tools are really the most important item when it comes to detailing, besides using my hands of course. Loop tools range from quite large to incredibly tiny, and are used for carving down clay that you've added to a piece. This is what's known as subtractive sculpting, where you add more than you need and then reduce it to the correct shape. Now, this tiny blue plastic thing actually came free with a children's toy slime kit for making small cupcakes and stuff like that. And hilariously, it's probably the tool I use most for shaping things. The flat side is the perfect size and shape for smearing on clay and pushing it into the shape I need it to be. This is what's known as additive sculpting, whereby you're building up a shape by adding clay to an area and pressing it into the right shape. Now, of course, while sculpting, you're not really consciously dividing what you're doing into these two categories, rather flowing between a combination of the two and really focusing on trying to replicate what you're seeing in the photos and have it match your subject from all angles. Speaking of shaping, this last group of tools I'll show you are for adding texture, lines, and smoothing the clay until it flows like a real human eye, rather than just a lump of plasticine. This Rake tool is similar to a standard loop tool, however it's made using guitar strings, which make it absolutely ideal for raking down an area with a cross-hatching type motion. This tool is so important for almost sanding down and buffing it into something aesthetically pleasing. It may look like it's leaving lots of harsh cuts in the clay, but raking in different directions and using a lighter and lighter touch can yield an incredibly well-rounded appearance. So, once I've marked out where the eye is going, I then hollow out the area with a loop tool. Now, some sculptors are very much against sculpting onto any kind of ball shape. They prefer to do everything in the clay, which is a completely valid way to do things. However, when I cast this, I'll be inserting acrylic eyes to really bring the bust to life. And for this, I need to know where the eyes will fit exactly into the cast. Therefore, I add in custom-made eyes to the exact size I require at this stage. They certainly look a little scary if you're not used to them, but honestly, I just find them incredibly cool, and I love seeing the eyes come alive as I slowly refine the clay around it to be closer and closer to a real human eye. After I've melted out a slot for the eyes, they look extremely rough at this stage. But that's fine. You've got to learn to trust the process and know that by the end, it'll look good with enough patience. Now, Henry has a very specific shape to his eye. Starting at the tear duct, it pulls up quite sharply towards the top and then begins to slope down towards the outer corner. You'll notice he has what is known as a hooded lid. This is where the skin above the eyelid comes down to mask part of the upper lid. In some men, especially as we get older, this can fully droop to cover the whole upper eye, giving the eye a thin triangular slit shape. Towards the inner corner we have the tear duct. This area is what's known as the caruncle and simultaneously is my favourite part of the eye, while also being the area I struggled most to understand. A friend of mine and very accomplished sculptor called John Cormican, who was a principal sculptor at the world-class Tussauds studio in London, once took a great deal of time over Skype explaining this area to me. I find it rather deceptive as it cuts into the head, making it look further back behind the eye. However, as your top and bottom lids meet, they pinch at the corner and begin to slowly sweep out past your eye towards your nose. As a beginner sculptor, this was a very difficult concept to understand, and this real-life reference model by Chris, better known on YouTube as Geek, helped me immensely. I will put links to both John and Chris's work in the description. Please do go enjoy their work as it vastly surpasses anything I've ever created. The upper and lower lids begin as approximate blobs of clay, smeared onto the guidelines where I've marked out their shapes. You're adding tiny pieces at a time and then carving them back until they start to resemble the volume of an eye and the area we're working on. Now, throughout every stage of this process, I am constantly rotating my sculpture and looking at it from above, below, underneath, and each side. However, due to how lighting and video work, it's hard to show that without ruining these shots by getting in the way of the camera. But trust me when I say, constantly viewing your model from all angles and distances is absolutely key to achieving the correct proportions and symmetry. It's important to pay attention to the thickness of the lids. Here you can see me working on the shape of the lower lid. This essentially cups your eye in your head and should run parallel to the shape of the eye sphere. you'll notice towards the outer corner that it begins to tuck in and almost tuck under the ridge of the eye socket. Small details like this can take a great many hours of refining to get right and can really begin to sell the look of a sculpt. Below the bag which hugs your eye, there is a second small fat pad that slopes down towards the ridges of your cheekbones and down the sides of the orbital ridge. This is another area that looks simple but takes a great deal of perseverance to get to read like a real eye. I try and think of it in a matter of layers. If you imagine the cheekbone to be the outermost layer, behind that is the fat pad which slopes back towards the eye bag, which again slopes back towards the lower lid, and finally you have the actual eye behind that. I used to have a tendency when starting out to have the eye bags further forward than the cheekbones, and it can really disturb the appearance of a sculpt if these areas are not anatomically correct. From here, it becomes a case of continual refinement, adding ever smaller blobs of clay and raking them down to match what I see from every angle of my reference photos. This sculpture is still unfinished, and I didn't want to rush it in its final stages for the sake of the video. However, the last thing I wanted to demonstrate is the smooth finish. This involves using solvent, in this case turpentine, very lightly and carefully brushing over the clay surface, and this can soften some of the harsher lines. This should generally only be done towards the end of a sculpt, as overuse of spirits can turn the clay tacky and unworkable. However, just the right amount can really bring an area to the final soft skin-like look you're looking for. I also brush over the eyes themselves to remove any oil that's been deposited during the sculpt. This not only makes them glisten and shine, but also happens to be highly satisfying, watching as the dull, dead appearance is brushed away to reveal the realistic shine. This moment always reminds me of Woody in Toy Story, having his eyes glossed during his repair scene. I wanted to include this as many people cite that scene as one of the first times they ever experienced ASMR, and I certainly get similar feelings every time I get to this stage at the end of a piece. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this little look into one of my hobbies beyond YouTube, and please do let me know by liking and commenting if this is something you'd like to see more of. To be honest, I could make a whole series on sculpture and not even scratch the surface of what there is to know. Beyond sculpture, there's moulding, casting, painting, and the hair insertion process, all of which are cathartic and relaxing to watch come together in their own way. So there's plenty more content that can be made if the demand is there. Just lastly, although many of my sculptures are personal and not commercial products, I will be selling copies of the finished sculpture either on eBay or through a dedicated online store. If you're interested, please do email me or send me a private message via Instagram, and I'll be sure to put one aside for you when they're complete. Until then, have a lovely rest of your week and keep an eye out for new roleplays coming very shortly. See what I did there? Take care, guys. Bye.